We're really excited to have you with us at our second roundtable to talk about gender equity and to really take the discussion now in the second round to even more concrete level with some really actionable ideas to recommend around policy and really to come to crystallize the real key priority areas that we would like to see Catalyst 30 as a collective start to address, recognize, call out, measure against, and put forward. So before we begin, I'll just share a few quick logistical items with you. We are recording this conversation so that we can return to it again afterwards and take away whatever we want, and also so that you could share it amongst your networks if you'd like to do that. So please feel free to use the chat throughout the session. Yvonne, our wonderful Catalyst 30 support person, is there to help us process the chat as it goes along. Inform if there are any Zoom or technical glitches quickly so that we can stop the conversation, try to support and help you. Recordings will be posted on the Catalyzing Change website. If decided otherwise, we'll let you know that, but as of now, that's what's been happening. This session will be streamed live on the Catalyst 2030 Facebook page if anyone wants to share that page. And after the session, we're going to send you a quick feedback form for some feedback on how it went. We really have planned this session without breakout groups today in order so that we can really drive a quite vibrant conversation. So I'm hoping that everybody will just jump in when we get to that point. As I said, I'm Megan Falone, and I'd like to introduce our other panelists to you. But first, I think I'll take you through the Catalyst 2030 Catalyzing Change initiative. So Catalyst 2030, for those of you who don't know, is a global community of social entrepreneurs, funders, and other social change innovators from across a variety of networks of all of those things that believe collectively in action and bold new strategies that need to be achieved in order for us to reach the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Really to focus strongly on partnership and the kinds of collaborative and collective movement that we all need to have if we're really going to make a difference at scale. So it was initiated by leading social entrepreneurs from the Ashoka, Echoing Green, Schwab Foundation networks, as well as other global networks of social entrepreneurs. The group is expanding to include governments, funders, bilaterals, multilaterals, and others seeking the achievement of the SDGs. So we're really blessed and honored to have you with us and to join us at Catalyst 2030. The campaign itself, Catalyzing Change, is a campaign of a large unified surge of virtual engagements between policymakers and the public with inspiring social entrepreneurs and intermediaries. And you will see in a minute how great the panel and group that we have today at the roundtable to discuss is. The series of virtual sessions is aimed at sharing how social innovators are responding to COVID-19, how forming collaborative partnerships can accelerate change, ways that organizations and entities and even funders with social entrepreneurs can co-create policy recommendations, to initiate dialogues directly with policymakers, funders, and leaders across the sector, including media, and to share the solutions and jointly work towards the new normal, which is inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. It features a series of virtual online catalyzed change sessions, of which this is one, that take place via video calls. And this campaign is led by the Catalyst 2030 network, who will coordinate it centrally. This is a self-organized group, and that means that people have with a tremendous will to put this together. So the speakers today that you're going to have a chance to listen to are Karen Downs from the Flourish Initiative and co-founder of FemQ. Urvashi Sunny, who is the founder and CEO of the Study Hall Foundation in India, Catherine Lucy, the founder and CEO of Solar Sisters, and we're going to be, I believe, able to speak with one of her Solar Sisters themselves. Sohini Bhattacharya, who's the president and CEO of Breakthrough, Atulanti Moket, who's the founder of Giving Women, and Dr. Scylla Elworthy, author, founder of Peace Direct, and co-founder of FemQ. As women and girls are being more directly impacted by isolation in the convergence of the personal and public spaces, under pressure, the load is falling more and more on women to deal with the impact of this current COVID crisis. But more than that, I think that what we have come to understand is that in every sphere, economic, conflict and peace resolution, education, enterprise, we continue to see women both as carrying a disproportionate burden of responsibility, but even more, them being this incredible opportunity for leadership and catalyzing change. And so the question is, why are we not able to get to a point where 50% of the seats at the decision-making tables and 50% of the power is in the hands of women? And that, we all know, doesn't just come from women being empowered. Moreover, it comes from this balance of men embracing that new normal and women taking up the mantle of that new normal. So that's what we're here to talk about, some real solutions, some real examples of how that's happened, and furthermore, what kinds of policy change we think needs to be in place to make that accelerate dramatically. So we hope that we'll be able to have some proven solutions that we've noted that are scalable locally, nationally, and even globally on this issue of gender, or changing social norms around gender and inclusion, that are easily replicable and can be shared with government and policymakers as well as funders. We're looking for policy recommendations which could expedite social change, especially in the post-COVID recovery period, as we're looking at the new reset. And then we're not going to have a breakout group today, so we're going to pose some of these questions to everybody just in a general sense to open the discussion up. And I have included at the end of this PowerPoint, for anybody that wants to screenshot this quickly, the contact details for all of the speakers who are at the table today. So welcome everybody, and I think we'll move right into the discussion. Catherine, I'd love to start with you, because there's a lot of discussion right now about both the health impacts of COVID, but more importantly, for you in Africa, where your work is really focused, the economic outcomes and the economic crisis that's happening as a result of a health crisis. Your women who are working in rural areas are really at the coalface of that economic, I would say, chaos at the moment. So could you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing, what they're experiencing, what would help them to get back?
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here, everybody.
Sorry. Policy help?
Whoops, I think I may have jumped in there a little bit early, but it's a delight to be here. And I just want to acknowledge that I see also Simbo Sojenran, who's the country director for our Nigeria operations, and Fatma Muzo, who's country director for our Tanzania operations, are also on the line. And I am going to put both of you on the spot a little bit because I think it's really important. Not that everyone hears from me and kind of filtered through me what's going on in Tanzania and Nigeria with the entrepreneurs on the ground, but we hear directly from both of you. I'll just frame it briefly in that we did do a quick survey of our entrepreneurs to understand what's going on with COVID. And I think what we see with COVID is just a distillation of what we see with women in economics and opportunity and the burden that you speak of, you know, this kind of disproportionate burden on women as caregivers, as family providers, as really holding their community together. in times of risk, in times of turmoil, in times of disruption, but also the incredible power that women have because of their place in the home, in society, and that they are the ones that we can look to that we need to look to really understand locally what's happening, and to make sure that they have the tools and the support systems that they need in order to solve problems and provide growth as close to the ground as possible. And with Solar Sister, one of the things that we see and that we heard back from our entrepreneurs in the survey was they're not seeing the support right now, both, you know, from economic supports, from policy supports. You know, the local women entrepreneurs are being very much overlooked and underserved, and they don't register as being the powerhouse of change that they really are. And so I think that's really up to us to help make that visible and make those changes so that we can really tap into that incredible power that they have. So Fatma and Simbo, I think if you could maybe unmute yourselves, and if you could give some more direct and local and closer to the ground insights, I think that'd really be helpful.
Ujambo, Fatma, are you there?
So I see
that.
I see Simbo and Fatma on, so I don't know if they have the ability to unmute themselves or if the host needs to do that.
They should be able.
They can do it themselves.
Okay.
I've asked them to unmute.
Fatma is there.
Fatma, are you with us?
Yeah, she's right here.
Okay, well, maybe that won't work. Maybe they're not able to for some reason.
Well, Fatma, if you are able to come in later, please just give us a hand up and feel free to interrupt, and we will make
She's
time.
unmuted herself. She's unmuted.
Yeah.
There you are. Hi, Fatma.
Yeah, so hi, everyone.
Hi, Hujambo.
Hujambo, how are you?
Asante. Okay. Tell us, how has it been for you?
So can you please repeat the questions, like what would you like me to share about?
So we're talking about how the impact of COVID has been on the local women entrepreneurs, and what you see, what you can share with us about that experience for them.
Yeah. So for Tanzania, basically, the impact of COVID-19 for our women entrepreneurs has been not very high, since most of our entrepreneurs are located in rural communities, of which rural communities are not that much affected with the COVID-19, but they have been affected on other ways, especially economically. The economy fluctuation. If there's an economy fluctuation in the urban areas, it goes straight even to the rural areas. So even their businesses have been affected somehow, but most of them are still active since we changed our operation approaches to them. They are doing, they do their business virtually right now, and they have contacts for their existing customers and their surrounding communities of which they can still do their businesses. But the impact, the other impact are still there. The other impact, like the economy has been down compared to before. And right now, as I'm speaking, the harvest season is starting, but they are not sure whether they will be able to resell, to sell their agricultural crops, since most of their customers are coming from urban areas and outside of the country. So that's the worry of which right now our women entrepreneurs are still having it. But the business as usual is still taking place, but a very slow speed.
Okay, amazing. That's Asante Sana.
Thank you, Fatma. So I think, thank you for that. And I think that just feeds into, you know, everything's that is connected. It's the women's economics, their social, and their family situations are all feed into each other. But that needs to come up and be supported at a policy level and at a cultural and community level as well.
Yeah, I don't know if I can just add just a little bit from the Nigerian perspective. So for us to COVID, the implication of COVID, which is the lockdowns, the restriction of movement, of course, affected everyone, but even more so our entrepreneurs because of the manner in which they do their work, which is mostly day-to-day and door-to-door sales. So they really felt the brunt of that. I mean, the government did announce some palliative measures. A lot of them are things like tax reliefs for like the big corporations, and even some payments or food palliatives to some areas. But with our research and our surveys that we did, as Catherine said earlier, our entrepreneurs have not received any of these things. They're hearing about them on the radio, but it hasn't gotten down to them on the ground. So a lot of them are eating very deep into their savings and their capital as well, prioritizing things like food at this time. Yeah, so I think it's really impacted them. We've just beginning to see some ease in movements over the last few weeks, and so things are beginning to pick up. But definitely in terms of it affecting their business, it really has. And in terms of palliatives, they haven't received any. They haven't received that support from the government. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's phenomenal. And I think, you know, it just keeps coming back to the fact that women have a more complex ecosystem that needs to be in place around them in order for them to both participate economically, meet the needs of their family and the responsibility of their family and the people who depend on them. And so that makes the equation different for women than it does for men in most cases. I'd love us to go, if we could, to Urvashi. Urvashi, what specific things are you seeing in the education landscape in India right now around gender, in terms of the larger discussions around how we can shift some of this awareness to children from early on?
Yeah, so, you know, in fact, I don't think now is very different from the way it's always been. Women's lives are pretty much always in crisis, and especially women from marginalized communities, from very poor families. Patriarchal structures are in place because of patriarchal mindsets or consciousness. And that has not changed, despite the fact, let me speak about India. We have a very egalitarian constitution, more or less. And we've had it since 1948. And we've had laws for equal inheritance, equal, against domestic violence, against child marriage, etc., etc. And yet, all of that still flourishes, and that's because the patriarchal mindsets are absolutely in place, and because we never educated. We had all these policies, but we didn't have any policy to educate people about these policies, which is what you're saying, that women need a special ecosystem. Actually, we need to really change the ecosystem so that women can flourish in many ways. And that is the patriarchal mindset. Education really provides a huge opportunity which we've lost. But what the heck, better late than never. And we do need to have gender education curriculums as a compulsory part of the national and state level educational framework. That's one of my recommendations. And to do that, there are many organizations, ours, for example, and I know there are others, that have developed these curricula which has showed impact. And there are NGOs all over the country and across. So the government should be using us and using the materials that we have, or putting us in a task force together so that we can develop better ones. Of course, this implies teacher training curricula as well. Then secondly, we really do need large-scale campaigns. We eradicated smallpox because we had a large-scale campaign. HIV got everybody so excited, there was one campaign after the other. Women's lives are in crisis all the time and we have no campaigns for that. So we need large-scale campaigns. We do them every year. I know Breakthrough does, and I hope Sohini will talk a little about it. And they do have an impact to help women look at themselves as citizens and be able to exercise their rights, and also to engage boys and men in the conversation at every level. Then we need gender training for men and boys at every level, And I think organizations working for women's rights should be advocating very strongly for a 50% reservation. Megan, you hinted at that, at every leadership level. And we should be grooming our girls for leadership right from the beginning. They don't know that they are citizens. And we have many laws in place. We have not publicized them. People don't know them. And if they don't know them, they don't use them, right? And so we should be having large-scale campaigns where we talk about the laws. And I've seen this in our work, that when people find out about the laws, I've seen women grow a little inch taller, and I've seen men look a little more carefully, around them. Oh, we didn't know all this, right? And so you do need people to, we need a policy that will educate people about the policies that we already have, while we are advocating for more egalitarian policies. Right now in the education field, the one thing that has come right up to the top is the digital divide and the embedded gender divide, in that, and of course, class divide, where everyone has been talking about online education. The government's been carrying on, and they act as though there are all these lines for people to get onto. Most people don't have those lines, and women particularly do not have them. So we have made a great push in our organization to try and bridge the digital divide, to start a smartphone library, build an army of digital sathis for women so that they have control over technology. I think with the weight of Catalyst 2030 behind us, all the social entrepreneurs working in education, and I know the Ashoka Network is also gearing up, we should be advocating very strongly. One, for gender education to be made compulsory, and I know NCERT is veering towards that. This is the time for all of us to plug in very strongly. To have large-scale campaigns for gender equality, women as equal persons having the right to respect and dignity and to work for their own flourishing, right? And we should be engaging with boys and men right from the early stages, right across the board. And of course, we should all advocate and not stop advocating for an equal participation, which means the quota system. India is a land of reservation. Well, heck, why we being left out? We should, and not 33%, but 50%, right? And also to try and get this across, that unless we get gender equality, really the whole dream of development is a far receding one. And SDGs will not be achieved unless we have gender equality, because it cuts across the board. So we have these shovel-ready solutions which we are willing to offer. And I think there are many other NGOs in India, I know, and I think I swear too, we can pool our resources, provided we can get them to listen. And now is the time, especially for gender education. I know Sohini, you're here, I know Pratham is here. We should be, and Megan, you're here. We should be advocating very strongly to have a word in the gender education curriculum that NCERT is developing for school and for teacher training.
The really interesting point, Urvashi, that you've brought out is that maybe we're just not being strong enough in our language. Maybe we're not being bold enough in the language, bold enough in the demands, clear enough in what needs to happen, because I think your statement that the SDGs will not be achieved unless we actually start to action this enabling ecosystem for women and that starts from education right through. I think we are not going to arrive where we want to arrive. I think that's really positive and strong language. So maybe we need to shift even further that way.
Dismantling patriarchy at every level, starting with families, and making a real push towards that. Because there is this empowering ecosystem firmly in place everywhere, right?
So what we're talking about,
have equality.
what we're talking about is really broad behavioral and social normative change is what we're really talking about. So Hini, on that note, I'm gonna change up the order a little bit and go right to your work, because that's really the basis of what Breakthrough has been doing since its early days. So would love it if you would come into this conversation and talk a little bit about how through your work you feel that that progress has been made in some places or not in some. So love to hear from you a little bit, Sohini, if you're there.
Thanks, Megan. I'm going to actually sound like I'm parroting Urvashi all over again, because our work actually is very similar, and so I agree with everything she said 100%. So we've been working on creating really value for women and girls in our society. In India, largely our work has focused on that. And also really creating a culture where we can say no to violence. Yeah. So those have been two of the norms that we've been trying to shift for the last 20 years, really. One of the things that we have seen and which we are really advocating for very strongly is inclusion of a gender equality curriculum in mainstream government curriculum. We are working with two state governments, it could be three soon. So 3 state governments, to make sure that we look at the mainstream curriculum and we see that it's peppered with examples of gender equality. So if you are given a maths problem, you are given a maths problem from an angle where, the boy and the girl are doing the same thing, or where you talk about, let's say, the statistics around early marriage in India, so that you are opening up people's mind and their attitude towards gender. We are doing this, in Punjab, we are doing this with the Punjab government, looking at all their curriculums, English, maths, moral science. We have a very well researched curriculum where we have done an RCT on that curriculum with JPAL, which shows that after 3 years of very intensive, rigorous training across government schools with about 15,000 adolescents, there was significant change in both gender-based attitudes and behaviors, not just among girls, but also among boys. And, if parents were, in the beginning, parents had zero gender sensitization. At the end of our 3-year intervention, parents behaved as if they were normal parents like you and I, who were gender sensitized. So based on that, we are scaling up this curriculum. We are asking the government to adapt parts of the chapters, or we could also look at your curriculum and put in, chapters on gender. And we're doing a training of master trainers who will then be able to train all the teachers in the government school system. Now, if we do that with the government, let's say we do that with the Punjab government, it's 4,500 government schools. So you're talking about a huge number of population. On the other hand, we have done another rigorous research in another small, geography in Bihar and Jharkhand, where we have seen that after very, intense work on social norms and a normative behavior change around early marriage, we've seen that girls in our, who have stayed in our program, has actually, improved their chances of completing education. So if it's 17% at places where we haven't done the intervention, it was 89% in our intervention areas. And the incidence of early marriage came down from 28% in our areas to as compared to 22% in areas where we didn't do the intervention. So if we kind of combine the school curriculum and the school intervention, along with a very intense community mobilization and a mass media campaign. And if you combine the two, you are talking about deep transformation that can happen at the geographies where you are working. And then with the government, you can actually scale up parts of that to include a larger population. And just to kind of close that, dismantling patriarchy is something, activists are calling it a pandemic for many years. We've regarded violence against women and girls a pandemic for many, many years. So, and now it's being called a shadow pandemic. So we feel a little cheated because, we were talking about the original pandemic, yeah? So I think dismantling patriarchy is very needed. We've run many campaigns, but I think what we need to do is all of us come together on one common campaign and run it across, many places. So, my offer is, to all of you to join. We'll be launching a new campaign on violence in a few months, and offer to all of you to join it. And, the work that we've done on curriculums and gender equality and changing attitudes, we are very, happy to offer it to anywhere in the world where you think it might work. So thank you very much. Happy to kind of hear others.
Thank you. Sila, I would love to come to you to talk a little bit about conflict and conflict resolution, because women, as we know, and we've seen in places like Afghanistan, can certainly play a pivotal role in moving those conversations forward. And I can't help but notice this morning the newspaper story was that at the Chinese and Indian border, they're throwing rocks at each other. Suddenly, South Korea is now about to explode again. And it sort of seems in the midst of pandemic. And all of these issues of inequality now. So I sense that we're at a quite tough moment here. Tell us what your take is on this.
One of the key things is to get well-trained, well-qualified women into positions of decision-making on how we prevent armed violence. If you just look at the stats of how many women, this was the UN Women's Study, how many women were sitting at peace negotiation tables after civil wars, only on average 2% of those round the tables, with the result that most peace agreements lasted only 5 years. When the percentage of women rises to 10%, those peace agreements last an extra 15 years. And I asked myself, why is that? And actually, it's obvious, because when you have two warlords negotiating resources, votes, money, all the spoils of war, what they forget is the debris of war, what's happened to people. And as soon as women come around the table, the issues they raise are how to care for the orphans, how to care for the widows, how to deal with burials, how to handle PTSD, all the things that are human outcomes of war and that prevent the cycle of violence going round again. That's what women are so good at, is stopping the cycle of violence. And I'll just give you one example from South Africa, where when Mandela came out of jail in 1989, he realized there would be civil war unless something was done. And what he did was to institute something called an architecture for peace, with peace councils at every level, from national right down to village level. And on those councils were people that were trusted: the chief midwife, the fire chief, the local sports personalities, the media personalities, people who had shown that they represent the interests of the local people. And their job was to develop a peace plan to prevent armed violence from escalating into war. And it was incredibly successful. Very, very few lives were lost compared to what would have been probably 6 million dead. I lived there, and that was the estimate if there was a civil war. And I'll give you one example of what women did. When there was a necklacing, do you know what a necklacing was? It was when they put a car tire round somebody who was accused of being an informer or from the other side, put petrol in it and lit it. And this led to terrible, terrible suffering and also incredible riots. What the women did was they were trained to walk into those situations that were brewing up with their staves in their hands, banging their staves on the floor with their hand raised like that, and said, "Stop it, go home, your mother would be ashamed of you." And it worked. It was to use that authority that women have when they are really riled up by the behavior of thugs. So I would just like to point you to a number of the aspects of the training that we offer now through a training called The Mighty Heart that you can find on the Business Plan for Peace website. And the three of those that I'd like you to just notice is one, how to take your stand. Now, whether this is in a family argument or a workplace argument or even a government argument, how do we as women raise our presence so that we get heard, so that we're not paralyzed by losing our voice, not being able to articulate, feeling inadequate. So we have to practice. And that means standing, literally standing up and taking your stand. It's very important to stand up when you've got something important to say. Secondly, rehearse it. Look in the mirror. Say it to yourself until you're really convinced by what you're saying. And then you will be able to more easily find your voice when the chips are down, when you're having what we call a courageous conversation. When you have to get something across in mixed company, or when you're unlikely to be appreciated, when you have to say something unpopular, when you have to say something that is interrupting the status quo, how you gather your, I would call it your goddess stance. Take your cue from the great women of your society have gone before, the legends of the women who have stood their ground for the things they believed in. And the last one I'll mention is using your anger as fuel. When we use anger as gasoline and spray it out everywhere, and somebody chucks in a match, you get an inferno. But when we use our anger in our engine, as it were in a carburetor, it's what drives us forward. It's what gets us up in the morning to do it all again. Gives us that incredible energy and power that we need every day to make this message heard. And that anger is very important if it's contained, if it's not blaming everybody, if it's not screaming at people, if it's used as your engine. And then you have your power, you have access to your power. So myself and Karen worked for a long time and still do on an initiative called FemQ, Feminine Intelligence. You had IQ, EQ, this is FemQ. And the aspects of it are, we would love to share with you. And it's a way of enabling women to practice these skills. So thank you for inviting me and happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Of course. Thank you so much, Scylla. I'd like to turn to Atlanti. Now, Atlanti Marquette runs a beautiful organization which is based in Geneva called Giving Women. It's an organization of women by, for, and about philanthropy and women-led enterprises, social enterprises, and social innovation organizations. And so Atlanti has a really broad view of many organizations and how we are moving both in the funding streams, in the organizational streams, where they're struggling and how they're making it getting their traction felt. So Atalanti, as a philanthropist, can you help us to understand a little bit better some of the challenges that you are seeing that are affecting small community-based organizations in this time? And also what kinds of calls for policy or other kinds of regulatory or enabling policies that might be put in place in order to help them grow and get more traction?
Absolutely. Scylla, that was really inspiring. It's very intimidating to come after you. So it is very challenging times. We've been talking about the situation post-COVID, and clearly it's not the illness, it's the economic effect of the illness which exists for the poorest communities. However, this is the reason we talk about it is because it's affected every single one of us. For the first time, we're all in it together. But when we really think about it, these crises occur to the poorest communities on a much more regular basis. And what's happened now is that we're aware of it. Now, what's interesting in the whole funding situation at the moment is because the funders are living the crisis with the most vulnerable communities, there has been an incredible response for the COVID response. And I know we made small campaigns which have been responded to very quickly to provide funding for livelihoods. In other words, so that there could be food brought to families, because most of the families that we work with are families that are living on a living wage. And once those wages are no longer there, they're struggling, they can't eat. So that has been responded to in a very significant way. However, what our fear is, and I think Megan is very aware of that, is that the programs that we're responsible for are losing funding, that it's going to be a big struggle to get funding out there. And so there are a couple of things that, as we struggle through this and we're working with our grassroots organizations that we have been talking to them about, is really starting to think more deeply about ways that they can be financially sustainable to some extent. So that's where the social enterprise mentality comes in, even in, what we would call development, really pure development organizations, a small grassroots organization. So I think it's very, very important now to really look at that. The other thing I think that, and I've heard this now from the speakers, that I think is really significant is we need to continue the movement. We need to continue, as Scylla said, where this anger about the reality is powerful. We need to continue to join together with one voice and not be talking in different, but really get together and have one voice and say, we've really got to look about this issue around gender equality throughout the world. And I think one of the things that I think, and it's interesting because we're working with a project at the moment, which is called Opera Fistula. And Opera Fistula have created a side project, which is really looking at using data in a way that can be shared collaboratively through all the organizations that are working around women's issues, and really use that data, share that data, provide the data to be able to create really focused responses to really change and really move the needle for a much stronger movement for gender equality. And the other thing I want to say is that we talk about the patriarchal system that needs to be dismantled in India, we say in the developing countries. Well, the reality is through COVID, we've actually seen that we have a lot of work to do also in the developed world. So I just want to put that in right there. It's something that we really need to educate everybody. And there are some great programs that are in place, but it has to be a joint voice. And I think this is the SDGs allow us that opportunity to share information, share data, and really get that movement and that advocacy as powerful as possible.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Atalanti. I'm going to turn as our last speaker to Karen. I've left you for last because your message is so important and builds very much on some of the things that Scylla started to talk about the inner goddess, which I am going to be taking with me through the next few months. But just the criticalness of the feminine in everything we do, and not having shame about that, and really understanding the strengths of what that means that we all bring, or that the feminine mindset, because men can also have a transformational, as we've discussed before, a transformational mindset. How do we move that forward, really accelerate that concept of transformational leadership, be it by women or by men, that touches those pillars that the feminine seems to represent, and is a secret weapon at facing some of these challenges?
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, everyone. I think just to pause for a moment and notice who's on the call. I don't need to say much more than that, really. So I've noticed how feisty I've been getting to speak to Scylla's message earlier about using our anger. And I noticed that when we set up this gender equality conversation, and bless Colin for showing up and being our partner in this conversation, but I wonder how many of us turned, and I didn't. I'm just noticing right now, noticing our own behavior of where we're actually separating ourselves from the system, or where we're actually producing more of the same. I didn't turn to all the men in my life and say, will you stand by my side? I didn't turn to the men and say, would you join us as we've joined you in many initiatives to produce a flourishing, well, now a crisis we're in, but will you join us in producing a flourishing future, and come to the gender equality call and understand what we're dealing with? Would you please join us? So I think one, for me, is a very big reminder today of who I didn't invite and who I didn't reach out to. And I think this is important that we recognize it. So one of the things that Scylla and I have worked together on is creating an organization called FemQ. And in 2016, we launched an international conference in Berlin. And once again, we thought feminine intelligence would be gender neutral. And we said men and women are welcome. And we need to recognize that what's been marginalized is the feminine qualities of nurturance, of deep listening, of holding community, of holding space, of rebirth in our own systems. And so could we have that conversation? And we represented women from all sectors of society who were leading women-led organizations to transform the sector they worked in, from politics to peace, to corporate, to education, etc. And I think we had, out of 140 people, we had 5 men. The same happened in London, and the same happened again in Los Angeles, where there's a minimal token gesture of men joining us in this conversation. And I really want to say enough is enough. Enough is enough that we are the women having the conversation when the men have not chosen. Now, on the ground, in the grassroots, where Scylla and I have both worked for years, but we live in the global north, and we're seeing the same situations that have been pointed out in the call. This is not exclusive, and now the pandemic has revealed it. There's been a 700% rise in calls to refuge centres for women who are living with their abusers. And the domestic violence, the figures went up. There are 173 deaths. Women are supposed to be safe and protected in their homes. 173 deaths of women being killed by their partner or their husband in violent and domestic abuse in 2018. And the statistics, we don't even know yet, have escalated exponentially. And so I think the conversation is, how do we provide the resources? And by the way, the refuge centres have actually shut down because of government funding. If we're asking women to look after community, if we're asking women to step up, and we're asking women to stand tall and be the goddesses, as Scylla beautifully said, how are we supporting them? How are we going to work together in a more collaborative way to actually bring this forward? And to ask, in my world, I work in corporates, to ask the corporates to fund these initiatives, not just the traditional funders. The corporates have to get on board and say, we've got a gender issue internally, why don't we learn from India? Why don't we go to Avashi and find out what Avashi's doing about educating girls and educating boys around gender? We have to combine and work together. So I think there's a big move to have boxes ticked and metrics acknowledged in the corporates, but we can't just put a woman in a man's chair who's operating out of the same system. So women have adapted as corporate leaders, they've adapted the masculine values and the masculine model, and that's not going to change the system. So really encourage women to bring, and training women to bring their grace, their, as Scylla beautifully put it, their goddess, back to the table and say that we are looking after community, we are looking after building human-centric organisations. So I think we've got very similar, but in different contexts. So I find myself now talking about gender in one context, which is what we have to discuss in India, but also the transformational leadership of feminine intelligence in the global north. We need it all. And it's just simply a context we have to have the conversation. And I'm just so grateful to be in the conversation, but we're not moving quickly enough. And all of the SDGs will be addressed, as we've said, all of the SDGs would be impacted if we moved the needle forward on this.
So thank you so much, Karen. That was, as always with you, beautifully, beautifully articulated. I want to open it up. We've got, technically we've got about 8 minutes left, but of course we can go a little bit longer than that for whoever wants to stay on the call. We will continue a few minutes longer. I thought maybe I've been making notes while you all have been speaking to try to frame up what are some of the demands or some of the things that have come out of what everybody said. And so I'll share that with everybody, and then we'll open it up for questions from anybody who'd like to ask a question of the panel or anyone in particular. So I heard that gender balance in education has to become non-negotiable. We need to have that passed as a resolution. That has to happen. No child, male or female, should be able to go through primary school without having had gender sensitization as part of their education process. A focus on dismantling patriarchy. We have to really refocus our efforts on specifically attacking parts of patriarchy and the continuation of those systems. Citizenship education for women. I thought that was one of the best things I heard. Just the importance of educating women from very grassroots to all the way to, you know, developed world, first world women. What are our roles and responsibilities as citizens? And how do we really take those up and action them at every level? Stronger language on what we need to achieve and why it's important. I think we just have to go really a lot stronger with our language. We will not achieve the SDGs by 2030 unless women are in these positions, which takes me to the next 2 points, which are a little bit related about who we haven't invited to the table. How do we change that system? The quotas for women seem to be absolutely essential now at local, regional, state, and country level. And then the issue around data, very important issue. Are we able to data up the key performance indicators that get women into those positions of responsibilities? And then can we hold people accountable with data? Because men understand data, governments understand data. Large multinational organizations like OECD and IMF, they understand data. How do we get our data heard? I think that's very, very important. And then lastly, it sounds like although we may think we have built a movement around gender equality, that movement clearly needs to be reactivated, re-innovated, and re-accelerated, because we are being outmaneuvered by lots of other movements that actually don't have 50% of the population as part of them. So let's open it up for questions or comments on any of those takeaways.
I think Shalini wants to say something.
I'd like to say something.
Sure.
Yeah, may I?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. That was very, very enlightening, excellent insights. And I just kept wondering, everybody is speaking of the same things. We all talked of bringing men, boys inside. Everybody is doing excellent work in their field. But somewhere I feel it is all segregated. We haven't come together, because despite so many of us, I mean, this is quite a few of you all doing such great work, in your own field, in your own countries, but it will only become a movement when it becomes one voice. And that one voice, maybe Catalyst 2030 should come up with a campaign, and everybody's small little campaigns in our own areas should join that. And it should be like the Me Too, hashtag Me Too movement. You see how powerful it was. We need something like that. Because why is it that you just said that we will not be able to achieve this if we really don't have a strong voice? And how do you get a strong voice? You get a strong voice when everybody's anger is, Skilla said so beautifully that anger inside should not be bursting, but it should all come together. And that's when a movement begins. The movement doesn't begin worldwide when you have these little things, with best intentions coming together. I don't know how you'll do it, but I think you have the potential to do that. Thank you.
Great point. Great point. Anybody else? I think also I'll just put a note in there. I was recently with Phumzile, this before the lockdown, with Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, the executive director of UN Women. And we happened to be in a forum with Rockefeller Foundation with some very young girls, young activists, in fact, from Egypt and the Middle East, who were in their mid-20s. And we were speaking about Beijing and the gender conference in Beijing and all of, the great work that was being done in the lead up to the next Beijing meeting. And these girls turned around and said, "What's Beijing?" So I think what's interesting is we forget this generational gap when we're talking about these movements, right? What's my movement for my generation might be a different movement to a younger person, might be a different movement to my mother. And how do we link those intergenerational gender movements together? Anybody else? Questions?
There was a question from Anjali. Anjali, sorry.
Anjali, sure. Anjali, are you there?
Anjali?
I'm trying to...
She's there, she's there.
She has to unmute herself.
Anjali, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes,
good evening.
we can.
Thank
Go
you
ahead,
so much.
Anjali.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Urvashi, for giving me the opportunity to join this conversation today. And I think this is excellent what we are hearing today. And it is really encouraging because as Urvashi knows that we have been working in those levels also in the organization I am with, Save the Children, prior to that also regarding women and their empowerment. So I just wanted to, what I wanted to say here, what was being said about decision-making role of women. So in our country, at the rural level, we had, this power given to the women legislators. They could fight the elections at the ground level, at the village level, and become sarpanches. Sarpanch is the village head. So what happened is, it was like almost 80% of women were winning these elections at the village level, but none of them were actually executing those roles. It was a proxy by their husband, their sons, their grandfathers, their father-in-laws. So I think basically there is no dearth of women who can lead, but there is a lot of need to give them that direction, build up that confidence, and show them how it can be done. So a lot of capacity building at that level for women, particularly at the rural level, to have that decision-making role come to them in a way that they can execute it, and knowing that they are supported also. So patriarchy is a very, very big reason that they push in women ahead, and they know she will win, but she cannot take the calls. She is not the one who is actually, bringing in the reforms and changes in favor of education and anything else. Wherever a woman has stood up for it, of course, she is boycotted, but the change has happened. So I think that is something which we need to really build on to give them that support system, a capacity building to become really strong leaders when they get chosen. They are getting chosen. There is no doubt about that, but they are not being allowed to do their roles. So that is what I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Urvashi?
I just wanted to add to that. That in fact, with the sarpanches only, what Anjali said, that I noticed that they started off just, and they called them sarpanch patnis, meaning wives, you know. But after a while, I noticed, we did a lot of training for them, that just a few years into the role, because they had the role, they learned to rise up to it, and it did an empowering effect. Of course, many of us, organizations, we did a lot of work in training them and empowering them. So I think we should be working at us first, grooming them to be leaders and raising their aspirations that they can, right from when they are children, making it normal. And then that builds the capacity. And for the ones who are already then who've missed that, then all of us to help with the capacity building.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just posting because we're at time now. I am just posting on the chat my email. So anybody that has any further suggestions, recommendations, policy ideas, or enabling economic kinds of vehicles that you think we should put forward in this note as we wrap up the recommendations, please send those directly to my email, and I'll collaborate with the women at the table to get the final note out published, which will have both last week's and this week's comments and thoughts on it. Anybody that would like to help in the drafting of that or would like to be involved in that, please feel free to contact any of us that were at the table today. I'd like to thank Karen, Urvashi, Catherine, Sohini, Scylla, Atalanti for being with us and helping to make this such a beautiful and rich conversation. And I look forward to welcoming more men. Colin, that's a call out. And any suggestions you might have to how we could get a 50-50 split on this call to have this conversation would be really wonderful. And the next roundtable, you are going to be at the table. So everybody, I wish you a nice afternoon. I hope it was an interesting session in this very busy and difficult moment. So thank you all.
And let me just acknowledge you if I can, Megan. Thank you so much for doing such a brilliant job and being managing so many different voices and perspectives. Thank you so much, Megan, for holding the space and holding a sacred space.
Thank you, Megan. And can we request for a single session with Sheila going forward? That would be fabulous.
For Scylla? Oh my gosh, Scylla, there's a call for a one-on-one session with you. Absolutely. We'll negotiate with her and see if we can get her to do a Catalyst 2030 cameo session.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good night. Good night.
Big hug, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Shibai, everyone. Thank you, Colin.